David, if you come now, you'll have the whole thing. Come later, you'll have a hard time. If you'll come now, you'll get it. If you'll come later, you'll have a harder time.
Everybody's coming right now.
Okay. All right, guys, just before we begin, I would like to make a public hachlata in honor of Yutas Kislev. I know I have been traveling, and I'm going to make a much bigger effort not to miss any classes by modifying my airplane times to when it's not 6:15 in the morning, because it's important not to miss, at least for me, to be more consistent. So that's my hachlata, and give me a second, and we are about to start. Good morning. With the help of Hashem, we are learning Yerushalmi, Kalayim, Perek Dalet, Halacha Aleph. We're learning today Daf Lamed Zayin. We left off on Daf Lamed Zayin, Amud Aleph, 3 lines from the top of the Amud. And we're dedicating this class, L'Refuah Shalema, of Rudi Rachamim ben Oreta Zahava. May it happen speedily and completely. Amen. So first of all, we're going to begin today's Daf to focus on the second case of the Mishnah, the case of Mechoil HaKerem, the perimeter of a vineyard. And if Kevin, if you want, you can put that picture up from the Mishnah. Mechoil HaKerem is the picture on page 35A3. All right, to have both the Shita Beishamai and Beisil. And let me just say the words that we're going to have to explain when we learn the daf today inside. Rule number 1 today will be Ein Ha'isr Natsa Mechitza, which means that when there's a wall that normally functions as a barrier, even by a vineyard, that if you have a halachic wall, you can plant the vineyard all the way up to the wall on one side. And then you can plant any other of the plants all the way up to the wall on the other side, as long as the wall has 10 tefachim of height. If the wall itself is made out of a plant, and therefore it itself becomes also mitzad kilei hakerem, that wall cannot function as a barrier. We're going to learn, listen at least to the words, that ein zonav lekerem gadol. The other rule, which will be more connected to our topic, ein mechoil lekerem katan. So we're going to define the meaning of a small vineyard, the meaning of a large vineyard, and what these words mean. Actually, what we will have today, aside of the pictures that we'll have from Art Scroll that Kevin will put up on the Zoom, we're going to have a case that Kevin will make a picture today. He doesn't know the case yet, but it's going to be a relatively easy picture to make that will be extremely helpful. If we'll have time, because it's a relatively small daf, we're going to start today Daf Lamed Ches. We're going to learn, I hope, the top rule of the Amid, the din of Rabbi Yudan. He'll be dealing with a Mechoil HaKerem that initially did not have, according to Beis Hillel, as you can see in the picture, the 12 amas or more, and therefore one was not allowed to plant in the area after the Kerem before the wall. But after that was there, a person put another wall in that area, in between the original wall and the Kerem. And there might be a reason now to permit the planting between these two walls, as we'll explain. That will be a question, and there's going to be a solution. I'll leave it at that. And let's dive right in. So we're learning Chavra Daf Lamed Zayin Amud Aleph, 3 lines from the top. Again, if you take a look at the picture that was on my Zoom before, you have the Shita of Beishamai and the Shita of Beisil, commonly, just to get it back. You have a Kerem, and people would plant walls around the Kerem. Does the wall have to surround the Kerem from all 4 sides? We'll speak about this in today's daf. But you can see a wall. Normally, the rule again is when you have a halachic vineyard, as long as you left 4 amas of empty area, otherwise known as work area, even though yesterday we learned the possibility that Beishamai holds you have to have 8 amas. We don't paskin like Beishamai, even if that shitas Beishamai. So we're going to just go consistently back to the rule of 4 amas. Normally, if you have 4 amas, outside the 4 amas, you can plant whatever you want. But since there is a wall closing in the vineyard, that's the case according to the Tanakama of Mechoil HaKerem, in English translated as the perimeter of a vineyard. In this perimeter, in this area, in between the Kerem and the wall, you have to have a lot more than 4 amas for you to be allowed to plant in some of it. Now, the 4 amas closest to the vineyard is Vadayasu, to talk about. Another thing what we learned, and we'll continue to learn today, that the 4 amas closest to the wall which he's calling here the passageway, is also an area in which you may not plant anything. Question is, how much space do you need to have in addition, in between the 4 and the 4, for you now to be allowed to plant in it? Machlekes Beishamai and Beisilo. Beishamai holds you have to have 8 amos. Let's go with the initial understanding of Beishamai to explain this, not the one that we learned yesterday, that what we are looking for is an area that's large enough to be considered distinct. And the machlekes Beishamai and Beisilo is how large must be that area, how wide must be that area. According to Beisilo, 4 amos. According to Beishamai, 8 amos. So therefore, Beishamai, a distinct area is 8 amos. So aside of the 4 and the 4, you have to have another 8. And that 8 you are placing in between the 4 and the 4, totaling 16 amos. If you have such an amount of space or more, you can plant in the 8 amos. But if it's minus 16 amos, right, 15 amos, really 15.9. If it's not 16 amos, you cannot plant in any place in the Mechayel Haket. That's Beishamai. Beisilo, who holds consistently the way we learned the Mishnah, again, not the way we learned yesterday. Beisilo is unique that he says, no, for an area to be considered distinct, 4 amos is enough. But he agrees with Beishamai that you have to have the 4 amos for the passageway, and vadai 4 amos for the avoid the empty gap. But in addition, you have to have 4 amos if you have that. That means if you have a 12 amos, then you can plant in the 4 amos that you will place in middle of the 4 and the 4. That's the picture you see in the bottom, and that is the shita of Beisilo, all according to the Tanakama. Now begins the Gemara today. Ezehu Mechayel Hakedem, says the Gemara that loisoif davar goder, that the din in the Mishnah, which has in it bein leBeishamai, bein leBeisilo, a need of having 4 amos closest to the wall. We're calling those 4 amos the passageway. Why do you need to have 4 amos as a passageway? So as we explained, that one of the reasons, it's not the only reason, but it's a reason that has to be there as well, that it was important for people that had stone walls to leave 4 amos closest to the wall unplanted. Why? Because when you plant, you have to plow. You have to make holes, furrows. If you make furrows in the ground near a stone wall, you weaken the foundation of the wall. The wall becomes flimsier. The wall might collapse. What you want is the opposite. Not only should you not dig holes in the ground, but people should dafka walk on the ground. So you compact the ground, you make the earth strong, and that fortifies, let's say, the longevity of the wall. Now, the logic that I just said, l'chu'ura, is only when you have a stone wall, because you have other types of wall that are much lighter, and they don't need to have hard earth around them. So what the Gemara is going to basically say, let's begin, that loy soif davar goder, that the need for the 4 amos passageway, both Beishamai and Beisilo, adjacent to the wall, isn't only when you have a goder. The word goder means a wall, a fence. Here it means a stone goder, which is where the logic applies. Says the Gemara Chiddush, it's called loy plug, elafilu asa pasin. Even if the type of wall that this person built around their kedem was made out of erected wooden boards, and not only is it flimsier, therefore you don't need for the earth to be, it's ironic, the lighter the wall, the less you are concerned that the wall will collapse. The heavier the wall, the more you need to have for the earth around it to be stronger. That's how it works. So if you have a wooden wall and it's not even fully walled in, if you have wooden board and an empty space, and a wooden board and an empty space, and now we are going to be using a term that we'll have at least once today, and if we're going to go to Daf Lamed Ches, we'll have twice today, the din of Lavud, if you remember. Lavud is a din that's primarily applicable by the laws of Sukkah, by the laws of Eruvin, right? Also, for the mechitzas, that if there's less than 3 tvachim between these 2 boards, and halachically, because of the law of Lavud, in ein bein pas lechaveda shleisha tvachim, they are considered either you extend the walls one edge to the other, or you fill in the space. It's as if the space is filled in, and therefore it's considered a wall. Still, nevertheless, you still need to have the 4 amos. Nidoinim ki goder. Okay? And even more than that, The biggest chiddush will be that sometimes when a person plants standing grain, they leave some of the grain standing unharvested for it to function as a wall. It's not a real wall. People can walk through it. But it's standing, this is the flimsiest wall. Elafilu kama, even if you have standing grain, or even more, even flimsier, standing straw. Gavaldik. That means a person went and they manually removed the kernels from the standing grain, and he leaves in the ground the shaft, the straw. And now, one thing, Chavra, there's two things, details, not negeya here. It has to be at least 10 tefachim high. And number two, they have to remain in a erect position, beruach mitsuya. Mamash, very much like we have in the walls of the sukkah. That means that if it's so flimsy that the common wind will move it too much, let's go with more than a tefach to either side, that's not considered a wall. The Gemara doesn't go into these details because, the point the Gemara wants to make is that imagine if you have a wall, for whatever reason you want that wall, maybe from Maras Ein, you don't want people outside the vineyard to look into your vineyard. That's all you want. And these standing grains, they affect that. No one needs for the earth around it to be hardened by people walking. You don't need that. It's a plant. Nevertheless, because of loy plug Rabbanan b'mechitzois says that Asherilio, the rule of the Mishnah is the same. That part of, you're going to have the 16 or 12, even, which means you have to have 4 amas dedicated for a passageway, even though in this case you don't really need it. Okay. Now, before we go on, now that we mentioned a possibility that you have a vineyard and it's surrounded by a wall of plants that are in the ground, the Gemara has to make the following point. That Va'asya, allowing for these standing plants to create, let me use these words, to create the stringency of Machayil HaKerem. If there would be no wall around the vineyard, if you want to plant something adjacent to the vineyard, all you need is 4 amas. Once you have 4 amas of avoida, empty space, right outside of it, you can start planting. Right? The wall, which is made out of straw, made out of grain, will create the chumrah that you have to have a large perimeter for you to be allowed to plant in some of it. Now, who told you that? Maybe if the wall is made out of standing grain, it's such a non-walled wall, maybe it doesn't have any effect, l'chumrah. So the Gemara says, Va'asya, and this will be consistent, that what? That standing grain will be considered the mechitza, l'chumrah, kai the Amar Rabbi Chanina, like that which Rabbi Chanina says. Now, it's amazing. Rabbi Chanina really was speaking about a din of how standing grains are not a mechitza, but for another law. What's the other law? Like we said in the Hagdama, that if you have a standing wall, a real standing wall, 10 tefachim high, and you plant the kerem all the way up to the wall, you are allowed to plant other plants on the other side of that wall. This is a din that we learned earlier in the Masechta. We learned it concerning Kilei Zeroyim. Chiddush that I'm saying now is that isn't only true regarding 2 different types of grains. This is even true if on one side you have a vineyard. That's the din of a wall. Says Rabbi Chanina that ein ha'isur nasa mechitza lahatza. That if the wall is actually a plant. So let's go, okay, when you have a vineyard and you planted for a wall, you planted, let's go, grain. You planted bamboo. You planted something that, I take back the word bamboo because I don't think bamboo becomes kalayim. But you planted something that could become kalayim, but you did it for the purpose of a wall. Which means that if someone later would want, and you planted the vineyard all the way up to it, it's within the 4 amas. So it itself, if one would want to eat it, would not be allowed to, because it's kilei akerem. It's asur bahana. So says Rabbi Chanina, if the wall itself became kalayim, then you may not plant on the other side of the wall products, even though normally a wall affects that type of heter. That's the meaning of ein ha'isur nasa mechitza lahatzel. If you want to use a wall as a reason to give the leniency of saving the area on the other side of the wall. You don't need to have the 4 amas because there's a wall separating. If the wall is only 1 amma thick, if the wall is 1 tefach thick, you can plant the kedem up until the wall, and right away on the other side of the wall, you can plant the tvua. The wall saves. So says Rabbi Hanina that a wall that is in itself, kalayim, can no longer give you that heter. Now hold on. Rabbi Hanina said a word that's extra, because Rabbi Hanina could have said the same halachim by simply saying ein ho'isur nasa mechitza. That kilei hakerem itself means a plant cannot become a mechitza. He added the word lahatzel. Why did he add that word? Because he's teaching you a secondary halacha. That when do we say that ein ho'isur nasa mechitza? Only lekula, only lahatzel. But if you have a mechitza that is kilei hakerem, but that mechitza otherwise could have created a chumrah. What chumrah? Our chumrah, mechoil hakerem. Because when you have a wall around the vineyard, you're no longer within the rule of only 4 amas for a work area. No, you have to have 12 amas. Such a mechitza does demand the 12 amas, which is b'diyuk how we began the Gemara today. In other words, sovereign meimad. He said yes. Nasa mechitza lesser, which would be the case of the mechoil hakerem, based on the logic the Gemara is giving of loy plug, even though you would argue, why 12? Maybe 8, 4 and 4. No, you have to have 12 because the rule that you need to leave 4 amas near the wall empty as a passageway, which one of the reasons that are needed is really theoretically only by a stone mechitza, because of loy plug rabbanan b'mechitza, is you need it always. Adkan. Gewaldig. Okay.
Probably on the other side of the non-climb wall, how big is the passageway?
You don't need any. You don't need any passageway,
even though you're building a kerem on the other side.
In other words, what Kevin is asking is that why isn't there a need of a passageway when it comes to the din of a geder? When it comes to the din of either side, there we say that as long as the wall is standing, it's mafsik. And here by mechoil hakerem, well, I think it's a 2-prong. I get it, Kevin. When you have a wall surrounding a kerem, anything that's in between the kerem and the wall for the observer appears to be part of the kerem. Anything that's on the other side of the wall does not appear to be part of the kerem. So when you're only focusing on planting on the other side, we don't need a passageway. It's not kerem. If the wall will collapse, then you'll deal with it. But
what about the
working area? Is 1 second. The mechoil hakerem is the area in between the wall and the vineyard. Since to the observer it looks like it's still the kerem, it's the vineyard. It's the perimeter of the vineyard. That's why you need to have a lot more space. Once you have to have a lot more space, how much more do you need? Now you can say the logic that you have to give 4 amas to the kerem. You have to give 4 amas for the wall. And then you have to have 4 amas to have a distinct area, and then you can plant in it. Okay, right. Now, Rabbi Yehuda, we're going back to the Mishnah. Rabbi Yehuda, after we quoted the Tanakama's interpretation of the words mechoil hakerem, which is what we learned right now, the Rabbi Yehuda disagrees with the whole thing. If you remember the words, Rabbi Yehuda says, Einzeh. Rabbi Yehuda says that that's called geder hakerem. Those were the words of Rabbi Yehuda in the Mishnah. Einzeh ele geder hakerem. In other words, when there's a wall surrounding a kerem, according to Rabbi Yehuda, you don't need anything more than 4 amas. Like in any other case. Yeah, wall, not wall. But there isn't this law that we have from Moshe Rabbeinu. You have to have, let's say, 12 amas l'beisilo. So Rabbi Yehuda explained, what does that refer to? That refers to an area in between 2 vineyards. Those were the words in the Mishnah. Now I have a problem with this. The Gemara is going to have, we spoke it out when we learned the Mishnah. If according to Rabbi Yehuda, mechoil hakerem refers to 2 vineyards, there is an empty space in between it. We don't say it's enough to leave 4 amas for one vineyard, 4 amas for the other vineyard. And if there's one additional amma plant in there, here we say you have to have another 4 amas in the middle, right? You have to have 8 amas. I'm sorry, 12 amas. 4, 4, and 4. We're going all according to Basil. Question is, I don't understand something. The first case of the Mishnah, in which Rabbi Yehuda did not argue, Korachas HaKerem, that we learned yesterday, that we learned in the previous year, that if you have a clearing in the vineyard, Lebesilol, how many amas do you need to have minimally of empty space for you to be allowed to plant in it? 16 amas. According to Basilol, how much space do you need to have? 24 amas. By Mechoel HaKerem, Beis Shammai says 16. By Mechoel HaKerem, Beis Hillel says 12. Why? What's the logic? I mean, just like an empty space in between a vineyard, what did we learn also? That even if you only have a halachic vineyard from two sides, you have to have, again, Beis Hillel, 16 amas by Korachas HaKerem. Why would the Mechoel HaKerem have the leniency of only 12? This kasha, of course, you don't have, according to the Tanakam. According to the Tanakam / the Chachamim, Mechoel HaKerem is a whole different thing. It's not a space in between Kerem. Kerem, wall, the space in between it. Makes more sense that a lesser area will be okay. But Al-Date, the Rabbi Yehuda asks the Gemara, and let's go with the version that adds the letter Yud, and the vowelization would be Yei Asa Kibetreich HaKerem. If Mechoel HaKerem means an area in between two vineyards, so why would this not be mamish like what we called Korachas HaKerem, which is a clearing, an empty space in the middle of a vineyard? And according to Beis Hillel, the Yoiseir B'Sheish Esrei, which would make it prohibited to plant unless you have 16. Here, Beis Hillel is going down to 12. The kasha is also with Rabbi Yehuda on Beis Shammai. By Korachas HaKerem, Beis Shammai says 24. By Mechoel HaKerem, Beis Shammai says also a lesser number. He says 16. So why, in other words, why are they being more lenient according to Rabbi Yehuda's interpretation of the words Mechoel HaKerem? That's the Gemara's kasha. Answers the Gemara Amar Rabbi Yoinam. Hadod the Teiman must be. It's not only that Rabbi Yehuda interprets Mechoel HaKerem, the area between two separate vineyards, but it's Kishe'ein HaKirasim Mechuvanim. It's when the rows of the trunks of the vines are not aligned. So since they're not aligned, let me go like this. When they are aligned, which will be also the case always by Korachas HaKerem, for both sides not to appear a continuation, for both sides not to appear like a continuation. Let's go to Beis Hillel. The farmable area in the middle only needs to be, if it's both aligned, has to be doubled. Beis Hillel, a distinct area is 4 amas, but since both sides are aligned, the observer will connect them. For them not to be connected, you need double workable area. Beis Hillel, workable distinct area is 4, double is 8. Beis Shammai, let's go not the way we learned yesterday. Let's go back to the beginning. Beis Shammai holds that the distinct area is 8. Double that is 16. So it grows from 16, it grows to 24. And Beis Hillel, the 8 grows to 16 by Korachas HaKerem. Mechoel HaKerem, Rabbi Yehuda, both Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel is Kishe'ein HaKirasim Mechuvanim. Now, what does that mean? There's a machlokes. According to the Maraful and others, if you can take a look at the picture, it's no, put back the picture. According to the top picture, I don't know why it happened. They're not aligned means that they are pashut planted in opposite the directions. So let's say the one to the right is planted top bottom, north south. The one to the left is planted east west, right left. In other words, one is perpendicular to the other. They don't look like they're connected. It makes sense. The less the two karamim look connected, the less space you need in between it. According to the Pnei Moshe and others, look on the bottom picture, even if they are planted going all, let's say, from east to west, they're planted all going, horizontally or all vertically. It doesn't make a difference. But if you can take a look at the picture, but they're not aligned, even that is enough for people to not right away connect them. In other words, the less connectable they are, the less of a space do you need. Aval indeed, but according to Rabbi Yehuda's understanding of Mechoel HaKerem, if both of these karamim will have vines that are planted mamish aligned in the same direction, one to the other, then indeed, then it would no longer follow the rules of Mechoel HaKerem. Yes, it would follow the rules of Korachas HaKerem, in which Beis Hillel Not 12, yes, 16. How great is that? Now let's go back. Let's go back to the original understanding of Mechoil HaKerem, which is the topic we're learning today, right? The Mechoil HaKerem is, again, the area between the Kerem and the wall surrounding the Kerem. We're calling that the perimeter of the vineyard. At Khan, says the Gemara, what's clear is that if the wall is surrounding the Kerem from all four sides, then I get it. That's a Kerem that's completely surrounded by a wall, and the perimeter becomes an area that's usher to have anything planted, even though you have more than 4 amos. No, you need to have, according to Basil, 12 amos or more. But is that halacha only or maybe even if the wall is only surrounding one side, on that one side, you have to have the 12 amos. On the other sides, you don't have a wall, you just have to go beyond the 4 amos. That's, this is a kasha. Is it only if it's surrounded by 4 sides, or is it even if it's surrounded by one side? Turning to the Lamed Zayin Amud Beis, and the Gemara answers. I'll tell you. Let's go to the Tana Rabbi Yehuda. From that which Rabbi Yehuda argues with the Tanakama, and he interprets the case of Mechoil HaKerem, an area ben Shnei Keramim. Now let me ask you a question. When you learn Rabbi Yehuda, do you think that Rabbi Yehuda's ben Shnei Keramim is only if Kerem 1 is surrounding Kerem 2 from all 4 sides? Of course not. Whenever a Tana says the words between 2 vineyards, what do you have in your mind? Between 2 vineyards means that, one is to the right and one is to the left. Which means that when you're standing in vineyard to the right, the other Kerem is only on one side. When you're standing in the other vineyard and you're looking to this side, the Kerem is only to one side. Now, I know that, in other words, it doesn't make sense that the Tanakama and Rabbi Yehuda are arguing in more than what they are arguing about. They're arguing in what's the case of Mechoil HaKerem. They both heard that we have a tradition by Mechoil HaKerem, 12 amos. Tanakama says Mechoil HaKerem means a gedder around it. Rabbi Yehuda says no, it means a kerem on the side of a kerem. Just like Rabbi Yehuda, side of a kerem means it suffices. There's a problem, even though it's only on one side. Same thing with Tanakama. Even if there's a wall only on one side, you got a problem, and you can't just go beyond the 4 amos. Since we learned ben Shnei Keramim, hada amra, so we can extrapolate. Right, lafusha machlekas. We're trying to minimize the arguments that afilu miru achachas. You have again the chumra letanakama of Mechoil HaKerem. And now we're going to push the question further. We're not done yet. So we already established this is all a chumra, guys, because the whole Mechoil HaKerem is a chumra, even if it's only walled from one side. Now let me go into one side itself. Does it have to go from one edge to the other? How big is the kerem? Oh, well, it depends how many vines did you plant in every row. Or even if you have a row that has 50 vines, and there's a wall that's only adjacent to 3, and as we will see, 3 vines in a row creates a row. Do we say even to a part wall in the area between the 3 vines and the wall, you have to have a minimum of 12 amos? Or do we say at least from one side, it has to go from one end to the other? That's the next question. So asks the Gemara, inquires the Gemara, or maybe not. Maybe it's even, like I mentioned, only 3. So the Gemara here again will know the answer. Nishme'ina min hadam. I will resolve it from the following statement. And we're going to learn 2 dinim. What are the 2 dinim? The Amar Rab Zeida, in the name of Rabbi Yasa, in the name of Rav Masna. Rule number 1, Ein zanav lekerem gadoil. Ein zanav lekerem gadoil. What does that mean? It means like this. Now, if you can put up the picture, this is Mamash Gavaldik. According to Beis Hillel, the minimum size of a kerem that we will thank you. And if you could, Kevan, you can put an X on the bottom row. I'll explain to you what I mean by that. When you have the minimum size kerem, the minimum size kerem in Beis Hillel is the configuration that you can look at the picture, which is 2 rows, One row is 3, and the other row can even be 2. The word zanav, you have to put the picture back up, is the word that we are using for the third vine on the top row that doesn't have a corresponding vine. That's called the zanav. You see that? Because it protrudes outwards. Now, if you have the minimum kedem, which is as in the picture, now that you have a kedem chevra, how much space do you need for you to be allowed to plant any other plant? What's the din? 4 amas. From where do you measure the 4 amas? From where do you measure it? So I asked
But the one adjacent.
Thank you, Yakir. I'm going to tell you that you have to add the x theoretically, and now from the x from the bottom row 4 amas. No, it's from me from this area you have to measure 4 amas. What's this area? From the protruding one and from the imaginary protruding one that makes it not protruding on the bottom line. Mashe enken. 1 second, Yakir. If Kevin, if you can do the same thing, I want you to do like this. I want you to draw a third line, and in the third line, I'll tell you better, Kevin. Make a picture where you have on the top row, you have not 3, but 4. And on the bottom row, you have 3. Make one row of the top 4 and one other row with 3. I'm going to tell you something gavaldik. The halacha of you needing 4 amas is not going to be from that fourth. Not going to be from the zanav. Zanav is one that's going out of the general box. What will be the din? You only have to have 6 tvachim. Because since even without that fourth, you already have a kedem, then we view that as an individual vine. It's a big leniency. In other words, ein zanav lekedem gadol means that when you have a kedem katan, we don't view the third of the top row. Thank you very much. Gavaldik. So when you take a look at that picture, the one that he's putting up over here, from the 3 X's on the top row, from the 3, not the 4, the 3, from the bottom 3 X's, you have to measure 4 amas in all directions for you to be allowed to plant anything. It has to be outside 4 amas. If it's within 4 amas, kalayim. Kilei akedem. But from the X, from the one that he drew all the way to the right of the top row, you don't need 4 amas. Why? Because it's called the zanav. It's hashvans. It's not part of it. So comes along all b'shem Rav Masna, Igavaldik. In other words, by a kedem katan, the zanav is part of the kedem. Like a tail of an animal is part of the animal. Go poke the tail of a lion. Go see what's going to happen to you. Don't do that. It's not a tail. It's the lion. Zanav la'roy, as the Mishnah says. You want to be a tail of a lion, right? A chassid of a rebbe. But if you have a kedem gadol, then that is called a zanav. That is not called a zanav. That's called a separate. And therefore, you only have to have 6 tvach. None of this is negated to our question, but we're going to go through his statements. Now, b'shem Rav Masna, another statement. This will be the answer. Rav Masna says, "V'loy machal lekedem katan." V'loy machal lekedem katan. Now, the Gemara will explain to you what it means, but let's read it inside. Ein zarav lekedem gadol. We already said this by heart. She'i at zaku kloi. Since in the picture that Kevin drew, where the top line has 4 and the bottom line has 3, you don't need that fourth. 3 and 3 is a kedem. Actually, 3 and 2 is a kedem. So since you don't need it, we're not going to look at that fourth on the top right as part of the kedem. Oh, this is gavaldik. Loiser chutzaloi yoiser mitoichai. In other words, look at the irony.
How many makes a kerem katan?
1 second. A kerem katan is the minimum size, 3 and 2. Now, what did we learn yesterday, guys? We learned yesterday that when you have 2 rows, we learned the Mishnah, I'll just repeat it. When you have 2 rows, what's the maximum space that we allow in between the 2 rows and still connect them? Less than 8 amas. Once you have 8 amas, we don't connect the rows. We do not connect the rows. But if you have 3 rows or more, Even if the 3 rows cave-in are 3 each, doesn't matter how much. It's about 2 rows. If you have 2 rows, no matter how big it is, if it's 8 amas, we say, they're not connected. And let me ask you a logical question, guys. A logical question. What did we learn today? What's the din of the Mechoil HaKerem? That if you have a wall outside the perimeter of the Kerem, if you don't have 12 amas, you can't plant. Why can't that? Kevin was asked, why can't you plant? Because it looks like it's part of the Kerem. If I'm saying that if there's 2 rows, and the space in between, the Mishnah says on that later, if it's only 8 amas space, they're not connected. So why would I consider the wall outside the Kerem to be surrounding the Kerem if it's outside 8 amas? If it's 9 amas, I'm going to say the wall is not even shaykh to the Kerem. If you have a Kerem Godoil, which means 3 rows or more, and the Mishnah says, not the way I said the mistake in the beginning yesterday, if you have 3 rows or wall, you are allowed to have up to 16 amas between each row. And we still connect them. When are they considered not connected? 16 amas. So then it makes sense to say if it's less than 16 amas, we view that area as part of the Kerem. We connect the rows. So the wall outside the Kerem, Libesilul, is how many amas? 12 amas. It makes sense. It's if you have less than 12 amas, it's considered part of the Kerem. In other words, what we are saying is that the whole din of Mechoil HaKerem is only by a Kerem Gadol. If it's a Kerem Kotel, the loy Mechoil HaKerem Koten. Why the logic? Because again, the loy Mechoil HaKerem Koten, loiser chutz lo yoisem mitoichai. Because we learned in the Mishnah that we quoted yesterday, but it's a Mishnah ahead, that what? That toichai, if you only have 2 rows, if you only have 8 amas of a separation between one row and the other, we're saying, it's not even connected. Yeah, if 8 amas make a separation, David, then the outer wall, if it's only 8 amas away, should not be connected to the Kerem. Why are you calling it the wall of the vineyard? It's not connected. Doesn't make sense.
Rabbi, you mean if it's greater than 8, it's not connected?
Even 8. I know it's 8. I know. In other words, just to make it clear that I learned good. I know I'm making mistakes, but this is clear. That if the space between the 2 rows is less than 8, by 2, they're connected. If it's 8 or more, they're not connected. But then if you have 3 rows or more, we're saying the same, but we're bumping it up to double. Less than 16 versus 16 or more. So if you're going to apply the din of Mechoil HaKerem even to a Kerem Koten, it won't make sense. You're telling me that inside the vineyard to connect one row and the other, we're saying, Shmoina. It means if you only have 8 amas, Kavan, they're not connected. So how can you tell me that the parameter around it, the wall around it is connected, and it has to be 12 amas away? Why? If it's 8 or more, it's already not the wall around the vineyard. It's already in a different neighborhood. The chutzlah shtei masrei doesn't make sense. When does it make sense? By Kerem Gadol. That it fits. Because since a Kerem Gadol has the din of 16, and by the way, that goes even Rabbi Shammai, because it fits. So 16.
So how does that answer our initial question?
Oh, it doesn't answer yet. And now the Gemara says, Ve'ezo Kerem Katan, Sholosh Keneged Sholosh. Sholosh Keneged Sholosh means, how do you have a Kerem Katan? Only 2 rows. How much is needed for 2 rows? Guys, I know that it can be 3 by 2, but that's why I told him to make an X, because really, even when it's 3 by 2, when you have to count, and since by 3 by 2, there is a din of a zonav. The zonav is part of it.
There's no difference.
You have to have 4 amas from the zonav. You have to have zonav from that imaginary X that he made. In other words, now that will be that final answer. Ha shalosh keneged shalosh. If you were to have not a Kerem Kotel, which is 2 rows of 3, what happens if you have 3 rows of only 3? That's the meaning. Shalosh keneged shalosh, 3 rows of only 3. Since for you to connect the rows, we are saying that even if they are within 16 amas, they're good, not 8 amas. So that's why it makes sense. Yesh lei machol. We didn't answer the question. So now we're going to answer the question. Now, based on the above, I'll tell you that if you had a vineyard, if you can make a picture, just as an example, where a person made 9 rows of 3. Just make that picture. 9 rows of 3. What happens if there's a wall adjacent 3 of the rows? What did we say? What's 3 rows? 3 rows is what? Is a kerem gadol. From 3 rows or more, you apply the din of a machayil. The Gemara is saying at the end that if you only have a part wall, you still have a din of a machayil. But why didn't Gemara just say it right away? Because it's not accurate to say it the way I said it. You have to say you have to have a wall adjacent 3 rows. A wall that's only adjacent 2 rows won't have a din of a machayil, because even if a wall will fully surround a kerem cotton, fully, you don't have a din of a machayil. All you need is 4 am space. Can't say 12 am, doesn't work. If there's no din of a machayil, then you go back to the general rule of 4 amas. You can't, and outside 4 amas you could. That's the answer. That asa pasin connected only shalish gefanim. Yesh lamachal. So not only does the wall not have to surround it, my friends, the wall doesn't even have to go on a full side. But what does it have to cover? It has to cover a kerem gadol. It has to cover, like you wrote in the picture. And by the way, Kevin, you don't have to put a line on both sides. You can leave your picture, even if it's a line only on one side. Since 3 rows, which has the din of 16 amas in Mishnah Daf Mem Beis, you have 3 rows. If it's less than 16 amas, we connect them. So it's logical to say that the area outside of it is connected within 16 amas. Now you don't need 16. You only need to have 12. But 12 is less than 16. It makes sense. This is Gaval. And we have 3 more minutes, and it's very easy. I want to go because the next year will be
very Gavaldic.
Now, first in. Now listen to what happened, guys. You have a kerem. Back to our normal case. And the kerem, you have 3 rows. You have 9 rows. You have a fence all the way around it. It doesn't make a difference. What are we saying in the Mishnah? What happens if they built a fence, Rabbi Mendel, within 10 amas? Then you can't plant anything in it. Within it. But we also learned today that if you would put the fence all the way to the kerem, you are allowed to plant on the other side of the fence. So if first you put a wall that was only within 10 amas, which means you have the isur called Mechayil HaKerem, Latanakam. It's asur. The 10 amas is asur. Then a Chacham went ahead and he built a second wall. He built it within the 10 amas. Doesn't matter where. Now you can argue that the area between the inner wall and the outer wall should be mutter. Because why would it be asur? Because first you build the outer wall. So the makim became halachically prohibited. Then you made an inner wall. Maybe since the area was already asur, it remains asur. That's the Gemara's kash. Guys, we should dance. If you built wall number 2 within wall number 1, what do we say? Maybe since it was asur, it remains asur. That was his question. V'amar is his answer. Im yesh shloisha tfachim. Again, lavud. If you have at least 3 tfachim or more between the walls, we don't say since it was asur, now it remains asur. We don't say that. You changed the status. You made a new wall. You changed the status. Mutar lahavi zera l'sham.
Wait, distance between the 2 walls, Rabbi?
Yes. Because, but if the inner wall is within 3 tvachim of the outer wall, even though you physically can plant in that area, asur lahavi zera l'sham. Because again, the law of lavud, when they are within of the other, we look at the outer wall as an extension of the inner wall. The outer wall is the inner wall. And that's why it's asur, even though physically there's a space. But as long as you have to, in other words, you can change the status from an isur to a heter by putting up another gader that's even closer.
All right, I'm sorry. If the distance between the 2 walls is above 3 tefachim,
not above. On the width of the ground. If it's 3 tefachim already, if it's 3 tefachim or more, you are allowed to change its status.